is a guy who steals your cocaine, then helps you to look for it. Good morning to you all. We're here this morning to do a talk on drugs. In February of '72, the United States Navy filmed a talk that I'd been giving around the area here for 12 years, and they called it the Chalk Talk on Alcoholism. As the years went by, a lot of people, especially my family, began, well, why don't you do one on drugs? And they asked a dear friend of mine, Dr. C.C. Knuckles from Orlando, Florida, who is one of the top men in the world on drugs. He knows them inside out, to come up and talk to me about it. At least I might be able to learn something from him. Well, he printed out for me, or had it typed up, the various families of drugs that I could memorize and use. I did not feel good about that at all, because anybody could memorize a list of names and say this is what they do. I simply felt ill at ease with it until the happiest solution of all came about. We asked him if he would do it himself. C.C. Knuckles has been an old and dear friend of mine for a lot of years. I don't say this about too many people, but he is one of the tops. Whenever you do anything that you hope will have an impact, you get the best. If you can't get the best, you get the best you can. Well, we got the best, and all he has to do this morning is open his mouth and begin to talk to you about the world of drugs, and you'll see that I was not exaggerating. So please help me to welcome Dr. C.C. Knuckles.
I'm always honored and grateful to be in Father Martin's presence, and appreciate being with you this morning. As I was thinking about this, a thought crossed my mind. I wished that in some way I could convince every alcoholic and addict that I had something better for them than their drug. And I've had a lot of feeble attempts at walking in front of people who are actively using or in the early stages of their recovery and saying things like this: I have this most wonderful thing for you today. And if you follow this path, and if you go to these meetings for 2 years, this incredible spiritual thing can be yours. And I would look out at the crowd, and they would all look back with blank faces. And I wondered, where did I go wrong? Well, the problem is that I don't have anything better for you than your drug. You know it, and I know it. I don't have anything that's better than a 6 to 7 second mental orgasm. That's what it's like taking a hit off a crack pipe. You know, it's interesting if you just think about it for a while. People have relationships with inanimate objects, piles of white powder, freebase pipes, syringes, pills. And you look at that relationship, and they've been willing to give up just about everything for it. They've given up homes, cars, freedom, family. We've had people who've sold their kids for crack cocaine. So the message that I would carry to you today is not that I have something that's immediately better than that drug, but I got something better than about 80% of your life. Because by the time you get to me and you hear this message, you probably have lost a few things. And if I were to ask for a show of hands, I bet that many people in the room would raise their hand when I ask them about loss of a job. Have you lost a job over this drug? If you hadn't, you might be here to try to save that drug or that job. I would also ask you, have you lost family? Have you lost friends? Have you lost people that could love you, kiss you, hug you, tuck you into bed? Inanimate white powder, a syringe, a marijuana joint cannot do that, but it sure talks to us, sure felt like love for a while. And you know, have you lost your feeling about life? Many people have thought about ending life, committing suicide. Have you lost your freedom? Have you been in jail? Are you in this program because it was a reasonable alternative to going to jail? These are the things that we can work with. This is the pain of addiction. And in essence, We have something better for that. And what is better is recovery. Now, I use the word crazy. Not so much that we're crazy people, but we certainly have done some crazy things. I remember in the fall of 1969, I was in a farmhouse in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and someone took a mirror and put it out on the table. And on that mirror, they put almost perfect little white lines of powder. And I remember taking a $20 bill and rolling it up and snorting that powder up my nose. And I can tell you today who was in that room, what we talked about. I can tell you about the clothes we wore. We had on bell-bottoms and tie-dyed shirts and all of that. I can remember the music on the stereo. As I walked out into the porch of that farmhouse and looked out across a field at a stand of pines, if I was an artist, I could draw a painting of the clouds in the sky that day. And I remember sitting down in a rocking chair, and I looked up to heaven and I said, God, where has this been all my life? This is the way I've always wanted to feel. I never wanted to end. It was spiritual. A false spirituality, but it felt that way to me. It was perfect. I was connected. I didn't want the world to go forward. I wanted it to stand still for that moment. And every alcoholic and addict can relate to that because we chase that vision, we chase that dream, that situation, that feeling for our entire careers of addiction. And you know, I sat out on that porch and I just wanted the world to stay just the way it was because it was home. It felt so right and so good. And you know, when I get home tonight, my little 8-year-old boy comes running around the house as he always does when Dad pulls in the driveway. He's going to scream, Daddy, Daddy, and he's going to jump into my arms. That's spiritual. That's real. That's sustaining. But you know, cocaine, to me, felt just like that. That's crazy, in a way. But let me tell you something that's really crazy. If I went out and got 1,000 people in an auditorium, just earth people, people off the streets, and I had little packets of white powder sitting up on a table, and I said to them, for a mere $25, you can come up here and acquire one of these packets of white powder. And when you take it home and you inject it, snort it, smoke it, even take it orally if you like, it's going to make you throw up all over the place. You go puke your guts out. Not only are you going to get sick, but you're going to get constipated. And on top of that, you too can itch like a baseball player on TV. You'd want some of that, wouldn't you? Well, that's what happens first time you inject heroin. First time you inject Dilaudid or take Demerol or Percodan or Vicodin. Makes you nauseous, often throw up. As a matter of fact, a heroin addict, if they hear of someone overdosing on another side of town, first thing they want to do is head over to that side of town to get some of that stuff because it must be really good stuff. If it kills somebody, I got to get some of it. That's crazy. You know, you think about this, that heroin addict, the person who ends up being addicted to that substance, they may wake up tomorrow morning, they may still be nauseous, but the first thing their brain is going to think about is, boy, was that some great stuff. Can't wait to get some more. I remember alcoholics telling me, first time they got drunk, 14 years old, hanging out with some older kids and out in the car. These days it's probably more like 10 years old, but from my generation, the baby boom generation, about 13, 14 was about right. You'd go out and you'd drink and get sick, and I remember a fellow told me once he got in a car accident and someone got killed in that accident. He got home, his parents gave him literally hell, grounded him. He was sick all night long, the room was spinning, and he was holding on to that bed, and the first thing he said to himself when he woke up the next morning was, man, was that some good stuff. I can't wait to get some more. Famous comedian once said, anything that makes you paranoid and impotent, got to have some of that. He was talking about cocaine. But you talk about cocaine and you go into treatment programs and you ask them to rate sex and cocaine, they'll rate sex a 6 and cocaine a 10. There's something about that drug that's amazing. And what I want to do this morning is talk about 4 different varieties of drugs. I want to talk, first of all, about cocaine and amphetamine, the stimulant drugs. Then second, I'd like to talk about the opiates, opium types of derivatives, for example, heroin, Percodan, Dilaudid, morphine, codeine. Thirdly, I want to talk about some of the legal prescription drugs. For example, the benzodiazepines, Valium, Librium, Xanax, the Heinz 57 variety of tranquilizers and sleeping pills. And lastly, I want to talk about marijuana, probably the most misunderstood drug of all. Marijuana probably accounts for more relapses and drug addicts than any other phenomenon, because every addict will come into treatment saying, but don't tell me I have to quit smoking marijuana. You know, maybe I've hit that pipe just a little bit too much, or maybe I need to get away from that heroin or those pills, but don't tell me I can't drink and smoke dope. I've been smoking dope for 10, 15 years. And so I think these are the menu for the morning. We want to talk about these types of drugs. And first of all, we're going to talk about cocaine and amphetamine. And cocaine has been around for quite a while. And when I use the word cocaine, I'm going to use it interchangeably with amphetamine because they're very much the same. The principal difference between the two is a line of cocaine may last for minutes, whereas a line of amphetamine may last you for 4 to 6 to 8 hours. So it has a longer half-life. It lasts a lot longer. But I think the drugs do very much the same thing. Now, if you think about cocaine and you take cocaine in the system, if you freebase, it hits your brain in 6 to 7 seconds. Smoke it, crack, rock, the terms that are often used. 6 to 7 seconds to experience something that feels almost like an orgasm. That's amazing. You start to wonder what happens in the brain of an individual. We've learned a lot about people's brains over the years. And we know that drugs like cocaine and amphetamine, as well as many other drugs and activities such as sex and maybe people who have problems with eating and gambling and other types of behavioral addictions, that when these drugs or activities take place, it causes a little area in the brain, in the old part of the brain, to secrete a drug called dopamine. It's called a neurotransmitter. And dopamine is your pleasure neurotransmitter. It's sort of like Ferris Bueller on his day off, you know, or Cyndi Lauper and the girls just out trying to have a little fun. It's really your pleasure sensation type of neurotransmitter. And when dopamine is released, it causes an overall pleasurable experience. It causes a euphoria. And this is what cocaine does, rather quickly, rather directly, and with remarkable results. Because if you start to watch people who are using cocaine and you start to think about the experience of cocaine, cocaine after a while starts to make you paranoid. And what does a cocaine addict do when they feel paranoid? Use more cocaine, right? That's the answer for just about any dilemma that confronts an addict. And so you look at this paranoia and start to think about it. I don't know if any of you out here are cocaine addicts or amphetamine addicts, but I will bet you that you probably have a trail between your carpet and your front door or your living room window, because every sound you heard at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning you just knew was a police officer. So you have to run over there and look through that peephole or around that curtain, and you may have done that hundreds of times during an evening. If you describe that to someone who'd never used cocaine and said, boy, this stuff is really great, it'll make you get up all night long and walk over and look out of your peephole, they probably think you're crazy. A little bit of craziness to that.
How about this paranoia that C.C. spoke about earlier?
That's very real. I can remember it vividly. And after you've done it a few times, you know that it's going to be a part of the high. And I remember before I would take that first hit, I had my home, I had my children, I had a wife, I had my own business. And I would go outside my house and look in to make sure that no one could see in. And I was very comfortable that I was safe. And I would take that first hit, and I'd look out, and at the end of our neighbors' driveways were the little lights down at the bottom that where they, were so you could see where you were pulling in. And when I would look out there, I knew that it was the dome light in the state troopers' police cars looking and watching my house. So I would have to go check it out. So I go out the door and pretend I was going to the mailbox to check on my mail to make it look normal.
Middle of the night.
Middle of the night.
Yeah.
And I'd go and I'd look in the mailbox and look over and realize that it was the lights at the driveway, and I go, okay, and I'd go back in, and a little while later I would smoke some more and I'd look back out and I'd see those lights again and know that it was the police again. I'd go back out and check the mail. So probably, you know, a half a dozen times through the night I'm going out at 1, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning and checking my mail.
So if we start to look at cocaine and amphetamine, we know that it causes a lot of paranoia. And at a certain stage, this paranoia becomes so intense that when you look in that person's eyes, there's somebody else at the wheel. There's nobody at home. They become psychotic. And a lot of what we read about in the papers, for example, someone gets killed over $25 worth of cocaine, this is caused by paranoia that's also delusional. They don't see reality clearly. It's 3 in the morning and you've run out of rock and you want to go out and cop some more, so you go out into an alleyway and for 25 bucks you start to acquire 1 rock of crack cocaine. And you start to think in your head, that person out there is trying to get me, so I better get them first. And so you blow them away over 25 bucks worth of cocaine, and the paper the next day reads, senseless, crazy killing. Someone dies at 3 o'clock in the morning. There's craziness about this. There's no sanity there. But we go out and we do these things happen. We find that there's jealous paranoia, that people who use cocaine, if you have a wife or a husband or a boyfriend, girlfriend, lover, we often find they start accusing each other of cheating on them. They start to get into what we call jealous delusions. We start to think that maybe they're doing things to hurt us. We've actually seen a lot of battering in homes secondary to high dose stimulant use, amphetamine, cocaine use. I think also you can actually sit in a room doing high dose cocaine and see someone who looks rather attractive to you and truly believe that that person wants you. We call that a form of projection. You actually project your own thoughts into others. And again, it's interesting to think about this. If we went out and described this to someone out there and said, man, we had a great time last night. We were snorting cocaine all night long or smoking crack. And they said, well, what did you do? Well, we got up and walked over to the keyhole and looked out through the little peephole about 100 times, and then we sat around and got real paranoid for a while, and, you know, people would probably think that wasn't quite a wonderful evening. On the other hand, if you look at what cocaine and amphetamine can cause, they can cause a profound depression. People coming off of cocaine and amphetamine runs, and sometimes the amphetamine runs can be up to 3 to 5 days or more, literally, when they talk about coming off that drug, they'll do it with a clenched fist to their chest. I have a background in medicine and cardiology, and when we would talk to people who had symptoms of a heart attack, generally what they would do is clutch their fist and hold it to their chest to talk about the incredible pain and pressure they were feeling. And we see this sometimes in our stimulant addicts, the same thing to describe the anguish of coming off that drug. One of the leading causes of death for cocaine and amphetamine addicts is suicide. We have a very high suicide attempt rate, and just about every amphetamine cocaine addict has thought about hurting themselves. Now, if you sum that up and you think about it, what I did last night was I sat around and I did a lot of powder, or I smoked a lot of rock and went over to the peephole a bunch of times and looked out the window looking for police officers and got real paranoid and thought people were out to get me. You know, and on top of that, when I came down off of it, I felt really depressed and thought about killing myself. Well, that's not the basis of a wonderful, intimate evening, I don't think. But if you're a cocaine addict, it makes remarkable sense to you, because it's what you say you're never going to do again, but 3 days later, or 5 days later, or 7 days later, here we go again.
When did the cocaine begin?
I had done cocaine, probably I could count on both hands before I went maybe about 10 times early on, like maybe in college. And then I was reintroduced a year before I went into recovery. And I started snorting cocaine and then started smoking crack pretty regularly. It wasn't a slow progression for me, real quick. And people talk about cocaine, that it's euphoric and they go out and socialize, and for me that happened hardly ever. I pretty much, once I started cocaine, smoking it especially, I was by myself completely isolated.
Had your marriage gone then?
Yeah, the marriage was over, and the house was gone, and the car, and the job, and at the end the job was gone also.
Because of the expense of it? Or
I
you were
was-
just out of the picture?
I
all
was
the time?
so crazy in my own head. I was violent. I was always depressed. Made some attempts on my life in and out of the emergency room and psychiatric floors, and you know, it was just such a shell of a person.
So cocaine, amphetamine, incredible drugs, very addicting, very problematic. But over the years, we've sort of seen a flip-flopping of addictions. If you go back to the 1850s, we had the largest morphine addiction that we've ever had in our country. You know, we had more morphine addicts during the 1850s than we had during the Vietnam War with heroin. They called it the soldier's disease. In the late 1800s, 1890 or so, Sigmund Freud brought cocaine to our attention, and we had a cocaine epidemic that lasted up into the 30s. In the 30s and 40s, we fell in love with the hypodermic syringe, and the face of addiction in this country changed. All of a sudden, we started to see people getting into heroin and starting to inject the drug. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, up into the 70s, what we saw were a lot of IV heroin addicts, along with the speed freaks, the amphetamine shooters. And if you start to look at that time and what happened right around the 1970s, especially in the 80s, we saw the current cocaine epidemic start to flourish. And with that epidemic, we saw a new way of getting a drug into the system called freebase. You could actually smoke it now, cut out the whole venous system, the right side of the heart, get that drug right into the lungs, left side of the heart out into the brain, and actually hit the brain twice as quick as sticking a needle in your arm. So we went from taking something orally to learning how to inject it, to learning how to smoke it. We've continued to form probably incredibly poor relationships with natural substances that exist out in the environment. And if you look at the current epidemic, what has started in the mid-'80s and seems to be flourishing now is the heroin epidemic. Heroin is an opioid, an opium-like substance, but heroin is starting to really make its presence known, especially in the Northeast and in other parts of the country. As we started to see the heroin epidemic flourish, it started in New Jersey in '85. It became very popular, Baltimore, Washington, New York. We've seen it in Chicago, West Coast. Florida now has a major heroin epidemic. And what we'll continue to see well into the 21st century is the next large epidemic, which will probably be the heroin epidemic.
I didn't really turn to crime until later, when I really got into the heroin and became physically addicted to heroin and things like that. I have to say that I first decided that I had a problem at about age 25 or 26, was when I first entered treatment. And it was because I was in the bathroom shooting drugs up, and my little son was knocking on the door, and he was I think he knew what was going to happen when I came out, that I was going to be different, a different person. And he became very upset, and that was when I knew I had a problem, and when I first entered treatment. But it took many years of, I would enter treatment, I would get physically better, and then I would conveniently forget all that pain, and I would pick back up again. I had a very difficult time getting clean, and relapsed many times. When I finally got clean, I had been clean for a year and relapsed, and used for another year. And at the very end, I went right back to where I had left off very quickly. The crime started again very quickly. And in the last about 3 weeks that I was using, I attempted suicide. I was arrested 2 times. I overdosed. I was totally out of control. I mean, I really feel at that point I had no choice when I woke up in the morning as to what was going to happen in my day. You know, I was completely at the mercy of the drugs.
Heroin is related to many drugs. Codeine, for example, is an opium derivative. Morphine is an opium derivative. Heroin is nothing more than morphine that has a chemical manipulation, a couple of acetyl groups added to it. And this was invented in 1898 by Bayer Pharmaceutical Company. The people that bring you Bayer aspirin invented this. It was invented, heroin was originally invented to be a cure for morphine addiction, or so the stories go. It was named after a female hero. So if you start to look at what's happening now, we're seeing a waning in the cocaine epidemic. We're starting to see a lot of methamphetamine still around, but we're starting to read more and more about heroin. And as we get into the 21st century, I think heroin will be a drug to contend with. Now, look at the drugs that are similar to this. Vicodin has been in the news. We've had star athletes and others who've used those types of painkillers. Codeine. In the healthcare professionals, we find that physicians often prefer Dilaudid, for example. Nurses tend to go towards Demerol, and the anesthesiologists just love fentanyl. All of these drugs are opiate derivatives, are semi-synthetic opiates, or synthesized out of a laboratory, but all are related to heroin in that they have opium-like activity. And that activity is a marvelous sense of reduction of anxiety. All pain goes away. A heroin addict could take a shot of heroin, lay out in the middle of the street with cars going by on both sides, and it might never faze them. Heroin, the addiction itself, the subjective experience of heroin is really amazing. If you think about it, you take heroin or Dilaudid or morphine, and what happens if you do the right dose, you get high. And with that high is a little bit of a nod. And after a while, when you come out of that, you reach a period that I would call abnormally normal. You feel absolutely normal. When I talked about earlier of feeling connected, of feeling spiritual, of feeling just the way you want to, there's that period of time where you have no worries, no cares at all, and you feel just the way you want to feel. Alcoholics describe it in maintenance consumption, hitting that place where they feel normal. But as you start to come off the heroin, what happens is you start to have subjective withdrawal. The feelings come back. The old memories come back, the hurts, the people you've lied to, the things you've done.
I remember the first time we were sitting around and, we were selling drugs and hanging out and, drinking beer and getting high, smoking weed. And there was this one guy that did heroin like every day. And he would always ask us, did we want some of it? And I was like always scared. I said I would never put anything up my nose, because I always thought like heroin was a real drug. Alcohol and marijuana wasn't drugs. Heroin and cocaine was drugs. So I said I would never put anything up my nose, and I said no. Everybody started doing it. I made the choice to do it, and I wasn't like immediately addicted to it, but after a while, I didn't know how to say no. I didn't know how to say no to him, because he would ask me on a regular basis, "You want to go get high?" I was scared. I was scared to say no. I was scared that he wouldn't like me. So I said yes, and I started doing that every day, and he would take me to cop, and then after a while, before you know it, I was taking myself to cop. And before you know, I was going alone, and I liked it. I mean, my life had got like so crazy, because I was like on the streets all the time. I didn't want to be home around my family. Didn't have a whole lot of friends, and I just wanted to be on the streets, So I would, I started stealing, I started robbing, and pawning stuff, and doing everything that was illegal.
And all of a sudden, after about 6 to 8 hours or so, the body, if it's addicted to that substance, actually goes into a withdrawal. And this withdrawal looks like the worst case of flu you've ever had in your life. But your brain is in what is called fight or flight. In other words, if you walk down a dark alleyway and all of a sudden someone kicked a trash can, your body changes, doesn't it? The blood flow goes to your brain and your big muscles. This is what God gave the caveman to figure out whether to run or to fight the saber-toothed tiger. 1916, Walter Buchanan described this as the fight-or-flight syndrome. It's a body's defense strategy. But all of a sudden, you're in that alleyway. Someone kicks a can, and your body is more concerned about running or fighting, so the blood goes to your brain and the big muscles. You're not so concerned about digestion anymore, and maybe excretion is another matter, but when you start to think about this effect, what happens is that heroin just shuts that system down. Alcohol does the same thing. As we talk about Valium and Librium later on, same effect. It says, don't worry, be happy. There's nothing out there that's going to harm you. You know, you're okay. And so if you think about that effect of the drug, there's something very, very euphoric about that, almost like a nice vacation. But when you come off of that experience, if you're a heroin addict, that system goes haywire. That fight or flight system just goes crazy, and all of a sudden the pupils dilate, you get perspiration, you can't sit still, you start to you have tremors. Looks like alcohol withdrawal, doesn't it? Same sort of phenomenon. Fight or flight symptoms, heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up. But on top of that, heroin addicts cannot even relax because of this fight or flight, and they have symptoms that are just like the worst case of flu you've ever had in your life. Your back hurts, the muscles in your legs hurt, your nose is running, your stomach's upset, you might have diarrhea. I mean, if you think about heroin withdrawal, it's not life-threatening, but heroin addicts will convince you that it is, because heroin addicts are probably the greatest addicts in the world. I've never seen a group of people that could work a nursing staff or therapist better than heroin addicts work doctors for drugs. They're absolutely remarkable in their skill set when it comes to drug-seeking behavior. So heroin is a drug that we'll have to contend with more and more. We're seeing it probably now for about the last decade, really taking hold in many parts of the country. I think that if you look at heroin and we start to think about the drug itself, the drug is out there, it's very pure now. We're seeing it come up from South America, not just the Golden Crescent, Golden Triangle areas. It is becoming a major drug of importation and a major problem. Now, we also talked about other drugs and that we wanted to mention today, and one of these drugs is Valium. And Valium comes from a category of drugs called benzodiazepines. It's best to think of them as depressant drugs. In terms of depressant drugs, we can think about alcohol, sleeping pills, tranquilizers. Valium, Librium, Xanax are what are called minor tranquilizers as opposed to major tranquilizers. It's interesting to think about this. Major tranquilizers like Thorazine and Haldol. Minor tranquilizers are like Valium and Librium. So I guess what that says is that if you really need major tranquilizing, if you need to be literally put out, you would give them something like Thorazine, but if you just want to slow them down a bit, you know, reduce the anxiety and kind of slow them down a bit, something like Valium will work very well. Well, as we mentioned, Valium works beautifully well in that part of the brain we call fight or flight. It just says, don't worry, be happy. But the problem with Valium and Librium is that they are drugs of addiction, but they're prescribed drugs. They're drugs that you get by going to a pharmacist. You get it in a bottle. It has indications on it that says takes 1 4 times a day. For example, with Valium, it might be 1 5 milligram or 10 milligram tablet 4 times a day. And so somehow that seems to legitimize this.
So the pills I can remember, I think, also being at a friend's house, a boyfriend's house, and he was going through his parent, you know, the medicine cabinet. And I think we found some Valium.
Now, was he on anything then?
We drank together and smoked weed together, but I think, and he said that he knew his mom took Valium and that it like mellowed her out.
Oh.
So we decided to try it.
And you got mellowed out?
Oh, big time, yeah.
Big time, eh?
Mm-hmm.
So there was an added magic in your life, this thing that came in little bottles instead of big ones.
Because it was much easier to conceal instead of hiding liquor bottles. I could just put pills in my pocketbook.
A major part of the addiction to drugs in the United States is found in our medicine cabinets. I mean, street drugs is one thing, but our medicine cabinets, I think, are loaded with the stuff that makes for pain.
Definitely.
As well as relieving pain. You know.
But what we found is that people who are using as much as 40 milligrams of Valium, especially if they're drinking with it, actually are candidates for some form of withdrawal. Problem is, people I run into in rooms like this weren't doing 40 milligrams. They were doing 100, 200, 300 milligrams a day on top of a 12-pack of Budweiser or a fifth of liquor. And so when you start to look at something like Valium, the withdrawal looks just like alcohol, except it's deceptive. And when you start to think of that deception, alcohol withdrawal starts in a matter of hours, doesn't it? But often we don't see the withdrawal from Valium till upwards of 3, 4, 5 days. Valium, Librium, and Xanax, and all the benzodiazepines have truly legitimate medical uses. It brings up, I think, an important point. There's a difference between being dependent on a drug physically and being addicted to a substance. When you go into a hospital and you have surgery and they take out your gallbladder, the doctor might prescribe morphine. And that morphine will help you deal with the pain, but they'll taper you off of that. But during your hospital stay, you might literally have enough morphine in you to cause a mild dependence to that drug. In the same way with Valium, for example, you could be put on Valium for an anxiety problem, and it might work beautifully for you. And for 10 years, you might take 3 tablets every day and never take 4 or 5 or 10. There's a difference between the dependence you might establish by taking some of the addicting drugs that are used medicinally and addiction. Addiction has with it the loss of control, the behavior directed towards getting more of that drug and using more of that drug and establishing tolerance. Most of us in this room understand that phenomenon. I've run into many alcoholics in early recovery that couldn't wait to go to the dentist just to have some teeth pulled out so they could get a bunch of codeine to use. So the phenomenon with Valium that's critical to remember is that it is a drug that can cause dependence. When people come into treatment programs, they're asked about their drug, their alcohol use. They often don't even talk about Valium or Librium or the other medicinals because these are drugs that are administered by a doctor and they're not classified in the same way as we classify cocaine. So what sometimes will happen is 3 or 4 or 5, 6 days into recovery, we start to notice that this patient is acting a little different, that they're starting to have heart rate problems and maybe going into seizures. And withdrawal from Valium, Librium, Xanax is life-threatening.
You were working actively in your profession. You're a professional counselor. And it was then, from age 25, that it started to get really bad.
Yes.
Could you take it from there?
Sure. I guess I remember that. I remember the time about that age. I had gotten married, and it was pretty happy times in my life. And I was reintroduced to prescription pills, and that included painkillers, Percocet, Vicodin, what have you, and Valium, Klonopin, sleeping pills. And there would be, early on, it was just sort of, you know, something extra to do on top of the drinking on the weekends, and then it turned into a few times a week, then it turned into daily because I had built up a physical addiction, and I couldn't go without. And I started going to doctors and asking doctors that I had backaches or had anxiety or what have you, and they would fill my prescriptions, and then that wasn't enough either. So I started to do some things that I look back on and, you know, regret. Started stealing from people's medicine cabinets, started writing my own prescriptions, stealing a prescription pad, started going on the street and buying my pills. Because I was getting sick. I would get physically sick and go through withdrawal, and everything started to suffer. You know, my work started to suffer, my health, my marriage, lost my house, the car, you know, everything just took a downward spiral.
We've seen as high as a 20% mortality rate on people trying to deal with this in their own homes. So this is very, very dangerous. So one thing we have to remember is that although it is a prescription medicine, it is a drug of abuse, it's highly addicting, and the withdrawal can be quite dangerous. The last category of drugs I want to talk about this morning is marijuana. And in a way, marijuana may have been number 1 on our list today, because marijuana causes a lot of problems, especially to those of us who come from the 60s who saw this as sort of a light drug, as a gateway substance. We put it up there with cigarettes and marijuana, and we didn't see it as something hard like cocaine or heroin. Now, marijuana, to me, is intriguing, and the best way to understand it is ask people who smoke it to describe it to you. They say things like, well, I'm going to go out and smoke some dope. Well, that sounds like kind of a crazy thing to do, go out and get dopey. You know, or I'm going to go out, and the kids say this a lot, let's go get stupid. Pretty interesting, let's go get stupid, you know. Someone asks you, what are you going to do today? Well, I'm going to go out and get stupid. What are you going to do? You know? And, you know, that's what marijuana does. I've read books that I read in the 60s when I was smoking marijuana, read them again in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and literally could not remember any of that book. You only have to have one book if you smoke a lot of dope, because you can read the same page 70 times, still not remember any of it. You know, you smoke marijuana in the morning, go to school, and you effectively don't learn anything all day long.
The next drug that I picked up was marijuana. And it was one that, you know, it was the first drug I said that I was never going to do. And
Why did you say that?
because of
I'll
the
never do
teachings in school and you know, how they told you how it was a gateway drug and that it was going to lead to other things. But what happened was I was determined to beat that and to be able to use it. But it was the first year that I used it, I was 15 years old. And in that year, I started using daily, going to school under the influence, you know, driving with other people that were high, and it was, you know, I put myself in a lot of dangerous situations in a really short period of time.
There's a lot of other problems with marijuana. Marijuana is very interesting because trying to convince people to give up marijuana is a lot more difficult than to talk to them about cocaine and heroin, because with cocaine I can say, look, leading cause of death is homicide and suicide, and people kill each other and they kill themselves. Well, what about marijuana? People smoke marijuana, just eat a lot of potato chips and watch TV and stuff, and maybe years from now it has an effect on your lungs that might cause you to have cancer, but that's not a real immediate argument. You know, I've sat in rooms full of people and I've said, you know, marijuana, we've had several cases where couples couldn't conceive, and we got the husband, especially off marijuana, his testosterone levels came back, his sperm count came back, and all of a sudden the couple was able to conceive. And generally in the audience there's a couple pregnant females in there whose husbands are in treatment because of their marijuana addiction, shaking their head at me like this, going, yeah, sure. You know, and marijuana also, I think, is important to consider in a few other ways. One of those ways is in regards to recovery. You know, a lot of people relapse. We found at one time that 50 to 60% of our marijuana relapses that occurred where the primary drug was cocaine happened because we spent so much time convincing them not to use crack or not to use heroin, and they went out, smoked marijuana, hung around the same people, places, and things, never made changes in their life, and pretty soon they're back using heroin, cocaine, and the other substances. So marijuana, a unique drug, remarkable in many ways. It's the only drug out there that has a biphasic effect. It can actually cause an enhancement of stimulation if you smoke marijuana and use cocaine and amphetamine. And on the other end, it can cause an enhancement of depression if you use it with Valium, Librium, or alcohol. So it seems to be one of these drugs that crosses over. It seems to make every other drug you use a little bit more profound. It fits in. Now, people say marijuana is not a drug of addiction, that you don't really get addicted to it and you don't have withdrawal syndromes. Well, you know, it doesn't look like alcohol withdrawal. It certainly doesn't look like heroin withdrawal. But people who smoke marijuana for long periods of time will have a withdrawal. And this withdrawal on about the second day starts out with headaches. They become extremely irritable, cannot sleep, and often have perspiration on their foreheads and their palms that smell almost metallic. Now, this is not earth-shattering, but it certainly shows that this is a substance of addiction. And the other thing that was interesting to me about marijuana, I asked a group once, what do you consider heavy marijuana use? And people would say to me, well, like 3 joints before breakfast or with a cup of coffee in the morning. 3 joints a week is considered high-dose marijuana use. Because if you smoke more than 3 joints a week, what happens is the THC count, the tetrahydrocannabinol, the active substance in marijuana, that count in your blood never goes down because it is so fat soluble it stays in the system. So if you're smoking more than 3 joints a week, you're going to keep that level of active ingredient, THC, in the system. And finally, with marijuana, I think a point that's also very critical is that this is a drug that we're finding a lot in people who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s. Still smoking marijuana. And marijuana is an interesting drug when you're 16 years old or 18 years old and you want to diverge and you want to sit in front of a speaker and hear music and write poetry that looks wonderful tonight but not quite so nice tomorrow morning. And, you know, things change. When you get in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, that's a land of dirty underwear. I mean, you're all of a sudden trying to pay the mortgage, keep a family, hold a job. And I found with many people who smoke marijuana what it used to do for them, that allowance of divergence, to sort of have unlimited access to anything and just to go in many directions creates more anxiety as they try to deal with what's going on in their life now, which is how do I pay that bill and how do I raise this child and how do I keep my job? And so for many people, marijuana just doesn't work. You know, it is a drug of addiction.
Very shortly, it went from an occasional social use to a daily routine and a ritual, to something that I did by myself. So the social aspect of it was gone. I didn't use it with friends anymore. I mean, I did, but I smoked it daily, multiple times throughout the day. I did everything. I got up in the morning and smoked pot. At lunchtime I smoked pot. In the evening I smoked pot. Before I went to bed I smoked pot. It was just everything that I did was under the influence of marijuana. And I thought that was the way I wanted to be. I liked it that way. After that, I mean, I stayed that way for a long time. 10, 12 years, I smoked pot on a daily basis.
Certainly it is a dangerous drug because we know so little about it and are so unable to relate to people the potential dangers of this drug. We're only learning these things. But certainly recovery and marijuana do not mix.
What I had to do was go into treatment, and during that time I got a letter from the state that they were taking my children and putting them up for adoption. I knew that I had to do something, you know. I knew that I couldn't continue as I was going because I was killing myself and I was destroying my family.
It was the last night I can remember before I went into treatment, and you know, I was thinking about my funeral and like wondering if anybody would come, and I didn't have enough guts or enough. I was so physically sick and spiritually bankrupt. I would just, I didn't even know how to do it, how to take myself out. And I prayed, and I hadn't prayed in so long, and I prayed for God to take me.
Point to where wife and children were leaving, and I couldn't talk my way out of it like I always did. Every jackpot I'd ever gotten in, I was able to talk my way around it, out of it. This time I couldn't. They had had enough, and my wife said that her and the children were leaving.
And I will never forget that relapse because it seemed like I had never stopped using. I used all night long, and I got to my parents' house and I was on the floor, on my knees, crawling through the carpet looking for anything to make me feel better, and I couldn't find anything.
Now, you all just heard the stories of these folks who were just interviewed. There's a sameness about them, and yet there's an individuality about them. There is a sameness about all addiction. It leads you into the hell of living a lie and dying a slow death physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And that's why all addiction is referred to as soul sickness. But they got well. Some of their stories would make many adults who have lived a long life look like a Girl Scout picnic. And here are these folks who started in their early teens and before into a life of addiction, and in their very early 20s or even their late teens got out of it. But today, they are living a happy, effective, and productive, sober life. There's a friend of mine who has a wonderful saying: despair knocked at the door. Hope answered, and no one was there. Most addicted people, my friends, get to a point of despair or near despair in their lives, and many of them even try to get out of life through suicide. But these people whom you just heard have held up the banner of hope for any addicted person. A couple of them, I don't know why they're alive today. I don't know why they were able, just physically, to live through what they did, and yet they did survive, and they are happy functioning the way they do. And so the whole purpose of this film is to show the entire world of addicts that it can be done, and there's a beautiful life at the end of the ugly one.
Today, you know, I'm like a soccer mom, and our kids are doing well, and I'm back. My marriage has been repaired, I think, with God's help. And, you know, I live a normal life that I'm very grateful for. And there's a time when I would have thought that was very boring and ho-hum, but now it's very cool.
And I kind of wanted somebody to understand me and, you know, just be nice to me and just understand how I was feeling on the inside and just say, well, you need to talk, you know, and just be there for me and just be there. And I needed that for so long. I had the opportunity to give that back now and just, you know, listen to people when they come in there. And no matter how low they down, you know, I can say, you're gonna be okay, man. You're gonna be all right, you know. You're worth more than that. I never heard that. And I get the opportunity to tell other people that.
But what I found was I found myself, and I found hope, and I found recovery, and I found a new way of life.
It is beautiful. It's not easy. There are days when I stay clean, but I don't feel very good. But there are days, every day that I'm alive, I just thank God.
Yeah.
My life has done a complete turnaround, and it's, when I stopped using drugs, that was just the beginning. I did not have any idea of the miraculous things that were going to happen to me as a result of going to meetings and staying in a 12-step program.
I feel like a person. I feel like I'm becoming part of society instead of looking in from the outside. I go to 12-step meetings, you know, 6-7 times a week, and the first time I went to a meeting outside of treatment, and I decided I was home. I found my home after searching for so long.
There is a thread that runs so true through every single one of the stories you heard and the hundreds of thousands of stories that you have not yet heard and might. Even though there are differences in each individual life, there is that common thread of treatment that is open to all and that works for each. The 12 steps of recovery, originally formulated by Bill W. and Dr. Bob Smith, the co-founders of AA, those 12 principles of living have worked for all addictions, even those that don't involve a substance. Gambling, emotions, EA, OA, Overeaters Anonymous, and so on. All of these things have those 12 principles in common, and they work. Because you heard in each one of those interviews, this one preferred heroin, that one preferred cocaine, this one was on alcohol. It makes no difference what you're on. If you're addicted to one, you're automatically addicted to all of them, but there's that common bond of a common therapy for all addiction, and that's the 12 principles laid down originally by Alcoholics Anonymous. And if you have a drug problem, there's your answer.